Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA greats against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names, and sometimes compare players from different positions. For example, lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, just because of their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do a comparison not between just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and have similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 6 different metrics to compare each player. The first category is scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game both regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency and advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage per and win shares per 48, both in the regular season and playoffs. The reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Field goal percentage tends to be biased to big men because of their height and play style closer to the basket. I also put in win shares per 48 here because it encompasses efficiency along with other attributes to give you an idea of how many wins a player contributes to his team. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks and steals in this comparison is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have steals and blocks tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by All-Star appearances, All-NBA selections, MVPs, Finals MVPs, and championships as the first, second, or third best player. The reason I have to only count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0, and it's not representative of how much better a player is if they weren't a top 3 player on their team contributing to a championship. I know including All-Star selections is a little bit controversial because it's fan voted, but ultimately this is what the Hall of Fame uses in their criteria to induct a player, as unfair as it sounds. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them as equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. The only one that's different about the ABA is that instead of Finals MVP, they have Playoffs MVP, which honestly is a better idea than Finals MVP since it accounts for the whole playoffs, but just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the ABA Playoffs MVP as Finals MVP here. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are counted, because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 80s, which is unfair to older players. Also, I'm not using any career total stats because that's a longevity thing. For example, no one would say that Karl Malone was a better scorer than Michael Jordan, even though he has more total points. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I have not watched most of these players live, or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. No time travel or what if this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. I'll be strictly basing their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. I start off this series by comparing 2 players that are remarkably similar in many ways, and yet have key differences. Everyone thinks of Kawhi Leonard when they think of a player who is most similar to Scottie Pippen, but I look to the past, and the player I think is most similar to Pippen from the past is John Hondo Havlicek, as both players were Swiss Army knives who could do a little bit of everything on the court, both offensively and defensively. John Havlicek is a Celtics legend, one of the greatest players in NBA history, and one that tends to be left out of too many discussions, as even within the greatest small forwards conversation, Scottie Pippen is usually brought up ahead of him. Of course, Pippen is an all-time small forward as well, and the legendary Bulls companion to Michael Jordan, and that's why I wanted to do this comparison. Let's find out who is the greater player out of these 2 legends. In this category, it's not particularly close. Although Pippen was a capable scorer from the mid-range and from close range, and certainly more athletic than Havlicek was, scoring was not Pippen's primary role, and he often fulfilled the team's needs as a secondary scorer. However, even when he was the primary scorer on the team as in 1994 after Jordan retired, Pippen's offense was somewhat limited and was never a consistently big scorer, as he had a career average of 16 points per game, peaking at 22 points per game in 1994, and a playoffs career average of 17 points per game, peaking at 23 points per game in 1994 as well. John Havlicek, meanwhile, although not much of a close-range scorer or athletic as Pippen was in the interior, was mostly a mid-range scorer that at times filled his team's expectations as a primary offensive player. His career averages of 21 points per game, peaking at 29 points per game in 1971, and playoffs points per game of 22 points per game, peaking at 27 points per game in 1967-1972 attest to this. This category goes to Hondo. In this category, both players were great rebounders at their position, with Havlicek averaging 6.3 rebounds for his career, with a peak of 9 rebounds per game in 1971, and Pippen averaging 6.4 rebounds for his career with a peak of 8.7 rebounds per game in 1994. In the playoffs, Havlicek averaged 6.9 boards a game with a peak of 9.9 boards per game in 1969, and Pippen averaged 7.6 rebounds a game in the playoffs with a peak of 11.8 rebounds in 1999. In this category, their numbers are so similar that I will put them as a tie. When it comes to passing, both players were incredible at their position as well, as both Pippen and Havlicek were known as the archetypal point forwards, forwards who could run the ball up the court to distribute to their teammates as a point guard would. Most people think of Scottie Pippen pioneering this position, but it was actually John Havlicek and Rick Barry pioneering the point forward decades before. Hondo averaged 4.8 assists a game for his career, peaking at 7.5 assists per game in 1971 and 1972. Pippen averaged 5.2 assists per game for his career, peaking at 7 assists per game in 1992. In the playoffs, Hondo averaged 4.8 assists per game, peaking at 7.5 per game in 1969, whereas Pippen averaged 5 a game in the playoffs, peaking at 6.7 assists per game in 1992. Again, just like with rebounding, there's no clear winner here as both players were incredible distributors at their position. So this one is also a tie. In this category, Pippen easily wins it, as he was both a better shooter than Hondo was and played more of his game close range compared to Hondo. Havlicek took his shots mostly on the mid-range, but even for his era, he was not a particularly efficient shooter. Pippen's higher per, true shooting percentage, and win shares per 48 backs this up. This category goes to Pippen. Some might think that this category will easily go to Scottie Pippen as one of the greatest perimeter defenders of all time, and one of the greatest and most versatile defensive players ever in general, both on and off the ball. However, it's much closer than people think. Havlicek was a very good defender in his era, with 8 all-defensive selections compared to Pippen's 10 all-defensive selections. Pippen has more all-defensive first-team selections, but we have to keep in mind that all-defensive was not an award until 1969, and Havlicek already played in the league 7 seasons by that time. So Hondo could easily have 4 more all-defensive selections added to his resume at least had all-defensive existed, giving him more all-defensive selections than Pippen. The defensive win shares back this up, as both Pippen and Hondo contributed quite a lot of defensive win shares both in the regular season and the playoffs for their teams. So surprisingly, this category I will have to put as a tie, as both players were easily the top wing defenders of their era. In the awards category, both Hondo and Pippen have an incredible amount of championships, and both are undefeated in the finals. John Havlicek is 8-0 in the finals, the best undefeated record ever, and Scottie Pippen is 6-0 in the finals. However, Hondo also has a finals MVP and was the alpha dog in 2 of his championships as the best player, which Scottie Pippen cannot claim. In addition, Havlicek has 6 more All-NBA selections than Pippen, so this category will ultimately go to John Havlicek. So when all the categories are summed up, John Havlicek takes the scoring and awards category, while Scottie Pippen takes the efficiency category, with the rest of the categories being a tie. Both are all-time great small forwards who could score, rebound, pass, defend, and do whatever their team needs them to do, but John Havlicek barely pulls out with a win in this one. I hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next comparison video.